Welcome to Defense Priorities video series reviewing the newly released National Defense Strategy. I'm Jennifer Kavanagh, Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, and I'll be breaking down the NDS with leading defense and foreign policy experts. We'll discuss what it gets right, what it gets wrong, and what it means for restraint and U.S. grand strategy going forward. In this episode, I'm joined by Miranda Priebe, the Director of the Center for Analysis of U.S. Grand Strategy at the RAND Corporation. And we'll be talking about how the National Defense Strategy aligns or departs from a grand strategy of restraint, particularly in Europe and Asia. Miranda, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jennifer.
So let's start with Europe. How does the strategy that the Trump administration has laid out in the new NDS align with a grand strategy of restraint, and how does it depart from that grand strategy?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of overlap between what restrainers have been advocating for in Europe and what the NDS and parts of the national security strategy that sits over it recommend for Europe's strategy. So importantly, they agree on what the most vital US interest is in Europe, which is that it's preventing Europe from being dominated by a single power like Russia. And the two restrainers and the NDS agree that the current level of US military involvement is not required to protect that interest. The argument is that Russia is weak and that Europeans are wealthy enough to have militaries that can check any kind of threat of Russian domination. So this isn't like the Cold War where that's like a significant threat that should be guiding US strategy in the region. Restrainers and the NDS also agree that secondarily, the United States should have a goal of just general stability in Europe and that and preventing large-scale conflicts. That's because the U.S. economy benefits from trade and other economic ties with Europe, and of course, the United States wants to reduce nuclear risk, which can happen anytime we have nuclear powers in conflict with each other, and wars, of course, cause humanitarian suffering. And also always the risk in the future that the United States might feel pressure to join in the conflict. So all else equal, I think the two kind of outlooks align on that being a secondary priority. And they also align on the view that stability is best promoted by Europeans being in the lead on security affairs in the region. Europe has the capability to do that, and US resources are limited. And so US interests demand greater resources being put elsewhere. And then finally, something that restrainers emphasize more, but it maybe doesn't come out as much in the NDS, is this idea that US power being exercised in Europe can also cause reactions that are negative for US interests. So US presence and US activism can exacerbate security competition with states like Russia. And so that's another reason why retrenchment can actually be stabilizing instead of destabilizing. And so, the prescriptions for both the NDS and, restrainers generally is that the United States should reduce its military role in the region, and that it should do so without provoking unnecessary instability. And the way that these strategies, I think, conceptualize avoiding that unnecessary instability is by encouraging Europeans to spend more on defense, to work more deeply and efficiently with each other so they're a more effective military coalition to check Russian power, but also the other side of the coin, which is we see the NDS and restrainers both seeing it as important to use diplomacy to stabilize NATO-Russia relations, including to end the war in Ukraine. So that's where I think we can see a lot of alignment between restraint and the NDS. In terms of areas where they go apart, this is really the differences I see are more pronounced when you compare the national security strategy to what restraint wants. So remember that the NDS is focused on the military component of our grand strategy as a country. And so, where we see the kind of misalignment between restraint and U.S. strategy, as the Trump administration has put it forward, are in a few areas. So one is that restrainers, I think, implicitly, although maybe not as clearly as they could have in the past, have made it clear that although they want more alliance burden sharing, although that's really important to them, and that's a big piece of the NDS, that it doesn't mean that the United States should be totally indifferent to Europe, our relationship with Europe. That we want, I think restrainers have talked about a gradual transition from Europe for many years because they want to still see, to still have friends in Europe. That in an uncertain world with threats to when you don't know what the threats of the future are going to hold, it's better to have friends than new rivals. And so there's parts of the new national security strategy, arguably, that work against that. Most notably, I think the national security strategy really places a significant influence in terms of just word count, but also in tone on U.S. involvement or U.S. Having U.S. Interests at stake in European domestic politics, in European migration policy, and in cultural issues on the continent. And that's something that restrainers have long called for the United States to abandon. And it's partly because they don't think the US is good. Restrainers don't think the US is good at managing those things, but also because, it can exacerbate tensions with potential allies, right? If we are trying to get involved in the domestic politics of our European allies, those allies might become more suspicious or threatened by the US, and it could corrupt, positive working relations where the US and Europe have overlapping interest. The second thing that the national security strategy does that is really I think a movement away from restraint is not really thinking about how our economic policies might affect Europe's ability to be an effective balancing coalition against Russia. Obviously, a trade war at a time when you're trying to get allies to spend more on defense isn't really compatible with creating domestic political conditions in those allied countries to spend more and to divert more scarce resources towards defense priorities. And then at the same time, I think the transactionalism in the NSS that we see in the NDS, where we talk about some allies having better relationships with the US than others based on things like these domestic political choices, is a potential way that you're creating divisions among our European allies when really, in the name of stability, we should be trying to promote that more effective, cooperative, unified Europe that can check Russian aggression from a restraint perspective.
Yeah, I think those are really important points. And I do agree with you that there is a stark difference between the picture that the national security strategy presents of Europe, which is a Europe that is potentially quite weak and that the US is concerned about, and the national defense strategy, which emphasizes over and over how strong Europe is and how strong it can be. They're very different. They're very different overall pictures of what Europe is. And I also agree with this point about retrenchment doesn't have to mean that Europe becomes an enemy. In fact, we can remain security partners. The issue that I think most restrainers have with the U.S.-European relationship is the dependence and this sort of automaticity or assumed automaticity of the U.S. security guarantee or what it's become. So let's shift to a different region here. To Asia, where the United States has identified Asia as a high priority region, where there are significant U.S. interests, which is a little bit different than how they've looked at Europe in the recent past. How does the administration's approach to Asia match or depart from how restrainers would like to see U.S. strategy moving?
Yeah, well, that's a much more complicated question to answer. And that's partly because restrainers have a range of views on US strategy in Asia. So generally, restrainers agree that Asia is different, that the threats in Asia to US interests are higher, both because of China's power relative to the United States, and also because of the power differences between the local states in the region, like Japan, and China. So those power differentials are just fundamentally different than what we're looking at in Europe. And so I think, where the national security strategy and where restrainers agree is that there's something different about this region. I mentioned that restrainers have a range of views. So some who argue for restraint in other parts of the world, like Europe and the Middle East, don't believe in a grand or in a sort of a regional strategy of restraint in Asia. So we'll kind of set that aside. But there are many other restrainers who, kind of argue for more global restraint, and then that group does argue that the United States should be thinking about some level of retrenchment from the region, and also want to see the United States focusing on diplomacy and using, attempting to stabilize competition with China. And so for that group of restrainers, I think the NDS has some good things in it. You see, compared to, for example, the Biden administration's approach to the region, we see a statement that the United States is not going to support any change on the status quo towards Taiwan by either party. During the Biden administration, we saw, some hints that the United States was moving towards a more explicit statement about defense of Taiwan than we've seen in the Trump administration. So I think restrainers probably see that as a positive development. The restrainers also, I think, generally are going to be happy to see the stronger focus on incentivizing allies in Asia to do more, not just in Europe, and especially the calls for retrenchment from South Korea that seem to be part of the NDS. So those are areas of agreement. The other important one that comes out in the NDS as well as the national security strategy is this focus on stability with China and not being overly confrontational. And that's certainly a message that I think restrainers can support and would see as progress in this strategy. But I think there's a couple places where there's some real tension between the national defense strategy and restraint. And some of it, I think, there's still more to learn before we can answer the question. So one area of tension is that the NDS, and I believe the national security strategy as well, ground US interests in the Indo-Pacific almost purely in economic terms. So the reason that we need to have a strong presence there is because the United States needs to maintain economic access to the region for US prosperity. And that's certainly something I think, restrainers can see the value to the US economy, but I think, many restrainers come from a realist perspective and so also think about this in security terms, which is that if China dominates its region and is able to project power, so not just dominates economically, but goes to the point where it can, kind of subdue all of the regional states or all of the states in the region and can also project power globally, that could create some security concerns for the US. So I think that's one area where restrainers kind of might just think about the interests the US has at stake differently. The other thing is that restrainers really emphasize the vitality of the US economy and the diversity of US trading partners as a source of strength. And so I don't think that most restrainers would agree with the NDS's characterization of kind of how vital the interests are that are the economic issue is for the United States. So all else equal, we want access to the region, but restrainers maybe are not willing to pay as much cost or run as much of a risk in order to protect them because they see trade with that region as important, but not vital. The other thing, I think the other big area of tension between the NDS and restrainers is going to be kind of how we implement this idea of denial defense along the first island chain. I think we should be clear that what the NDS is calling for, it's a strategy of containment. And that, it's containing China in a certain area in order to maintain US access to that area. I think many restrainers, not all, but many restrainers are, in contrast, willing to accept some growth in Chinese influence in the region, and perhaps wouldn't characterize their own view of U.S. strategy as one of containment. And some restrainers also, as I mentioned at the beginning, are willing to think about limited retrenchment from the region, not just South Korea, but maybe also kind of reducing support to Japan and the Philippines as well, and just generally the region more broadly. So I think the extent of that tension between the NDS and restraint is going to depend a lot on, there's sort of that broader outlook tension, But I think how stark that tension is will really depend on how it's implemented. So how does the NDS, how does this kind of trickle down into U.S. presence in the region, U.S. Military activities in peacetime to war plans? And I think that is not clear from the details we have in the NDS so far.
Yeah, I agree completely. To me, it seemed like the strategy was the Asia piece was somewhere in the middle. Like it made a lot of great steps towards restraint, in the sense that it did really express a different perception of China, a desire to have this peaceful coexistence and to stabilize the relationship, to recognize China's security interests, just like the U.S. has interests and economic interests in the region. But the doubling down on the first island chain to me was sort of the opposite direction. And so I agree with you. It really does depend on how this is implemented over time. So Miranda, last question for you is, overall as a restrainer, should I feel good about this strategy? Is this moving us towards restraint or away from it?
Unfortunately, I think it's not a black or white issue. I think it's a mixed picture. As we just talked about in Europe and Asia, there's kind of some good parts from a restraint perspective and some parts that are maybe even kind of going in the wrong direction from a restraint perspective. So I think you really have to evaluate this on a region by region issue, not overall, is this good or bad from a restraint perspective. I'll mention a couple other things that, are kind of big picture areas of consistency and inconsistency with restraint beyond the regional strategies. I mean, one is that, when we step back, the NDS, I think, agrees with restrainers at some high level, on some high level issues, that past strategies have squandered U.S. resources, that there needs to be more of a prioritization of U.S. interests, given the changes in the distribution of power and the U.S. economic situation. You see an explicit rejection of nation building by force. And the idea that the two strategies share the view of alliances needing to be reassessed and evolved based on today's strategic circumstances. So I think those are kind of really high level strategic things that restrainers can get behind with this strategy. Where I think at a high level we see divergence is even just from the very outset, describing the world as one of the most dangerous we've ever faced in our nation's history. Restrainers, I think, are much more moderate in their tone about the kind of threat that the United States faces overall, and really emphasize relative U.S. security, especially today compared to the past, like the Cold War. A couple other inconsistencies I'll mention between restraint and the NDS. One is, I'm not sure how much this came across in the NDS versus the national security strategy, but being more willing to threaten and use force to achieve things like leadership change and non-proliferation goals, those are things that restrainers have been very vocal against. There's also, I think, a stronger tone, especially in the national security strategy, that the United States needs to sometimes directly control territory. And that's another area, where restrainers have really emphasized over the years that direct control of territory is often counterproductive, not positive for U.S. security.
Okay, so I should move ahead with some optimism, but also maybe some anticipation for the next national defense strategy. Miranda, thank you so much for joining us today, and to everyone else, thanks for tuning in, and be sure to watch the other videos in this series.